The long gallery at Wyndham Park had been built by a man who believed that art was less about beauty than about authority. And the room reflected his philosophy with considerable precision. It ran the full length of the east wing, lit by tall north-facing windows that threw a grey and merciless light across 3 centuries of acquisitions, and its walls were so crowded with gilt frames that the paintings had begun to look less like art than like wallpaper made of old money. The guests who moved through it that November afternoon moved slowly, as people do in museums, with their hands clasped behind their backs and their eyes performing the polite labor of appreciation. And at the far end of the room, beneath a chandelier that had cost more than most men earned in a lifetime, stood Lord Edmund Hale, the Earl of Thornwick, who was explaining to no one in particular why a painting was wrong. He was not addressing anyone. That was the first thing you needed to understand about him. He spoke the way some men breathe, continuously, without much thought, for who might be listening, certain, in the way that only a very clever man who has never once been corrected can be certain. He was 38 and angular, and dressed with the quiet perfection of someone who has decided that elegance is a form of argument. He had opinions about everything in that gallery, and he shared them in a voice pitched to carry, without appearing to be raised, and the small crowd that had gathered near him wore the expressions of people who had come to watch a very good tennis player and had found, to their slight discomfort, that they were the bulls. I want you to understand what the Earl of Thornwick was in that world. He was not merely a collector, though he was that, with a collection that had been written about in 3 publications and envied in 6 countries. He was the authority, the man whose approval transformed a work from expensive to significant. The man whose single raised eyebrow across an auction room could end a bidding war without a word. Curators wrote to him, dealers feared him, and Sir Alistair Wyndham, who had assembled this autumn gathering of collectors and society figures with the bright-eyed anxiety of a man seeking approval, had secured the Earl's attendance as the crown jewel of his season and was currently standing 3 feet behind him, vibrating gently with pride. At the other end of the gallery, sitting in a chair near the window with a small notebook open in her lap, was a woman nobody had invited. I mean that precisely. She had been brought to Wyndham Park because her employer had been invited, and a companion goes where her employer goes, the way a shadow goes where a person goes, not chosen, not noticed, simply present. Her name was Miss Nora Pruitt, and she was 27 years old, and she was doing something that no one else in that gallery was doing, which was actually looking at the paintings. Not at all of them. She had been looking at one in particular for the better part of an hour. It was a small canvas, dark with age and proximity to what had clearly been decades of fireplace smoke, propped against the far wall on a wooden stand in the way that objects are propped when they are waiting to be removed. Someone had evidently decided it was not worth hanging. It showed a woman at a window, Dutch or Flemish by the style, early 17th century, if you trusted the brushwork, which Nora Pruitt did, because she had been trusting brushwork since she was 9 years old, and her father first taught her what it meant when the shadows fell exactly that way. I will tell you about her father presently. I always begin my stories at the wrong end, which is to say the end that matters most, and then I circle back around to the beginning, where the whole shape of the thing becomes clear. But for now, you need only know what Lord Thornwick knew, which was that there was a woman in a sensible grey dress sitting in a chair and squinting at a painting no one cared about, and that this was the sort of thing he found mildly contemptible, the way a surgeon finds it contemptible when a person with no medical training attempts a diagnosis. He said something to Sir Alistair quietly. Sir Alistair laughed. The laugh was just loud enough to carry, which was the point of it. Then the Earl moved down the gallery toward her, not to speak to her, simply to stand in proximity to the painting she was studying, because it was near a Rembrandt drawing he wished to examine. He stood there for a moment, glancing between the drawing and the small, smoky canvas with its woman at a window, and then he said, to Sir Alistair at his elbow, and to the 3 or 4 guests within range, in the pleasant carrying voice he used for everything he wished to perform in public. Charming that the household staff has developed an interest in attribution. The small group responded as small groups do when a man of authority makes a joke at someone's expense. Politely, with suppressed smiles, with the slight collective exhale of people relieved to be on the right side of the observation. Miss Nora Pruitt looked up from her notebook. She did not flush, she did not look away. She looked at the Earl of Thornwick with the calm, direct gaze of a woman who has spent years learning that the cost of showing what you feel is higher than the cost of not feeling it, and she said in a voice that was quieter than his, but carried just as far, "I'm Lady Crane's companion, my lord. Not the household staff. Though I'm not sure the distinction matters as much as you suppose." And before he could respond to that, she turned back to the canvas and said, "May I ask when you acquired the Mertons?" There was a pause. "The what?" said Sir Alistair. "The Mertons." She nodded toward the enormous painting that occupied the center of the east wall, in a frame that alone had probably cost as much as a small house, a dramatic hunting scene, dark with drama and expensive with pride of place. "You paid for it last spring at the Coventry sale, if I'm remembering correctly." The attribution was to Philip's Wouwerman, dated 1665. It was the centerpiece of the auction. Sir Alistair straightened with pleasure. Indeed it was. Lord Thornwick was good enough to authenticate it personally. "I see," said Nora Pruitt. She said nothing else for a moment. She made one small note in her notebook. Then, because the Earl of Thornwick was watching her with the particular cool attention of a man who is beginning, against his will, to be curious, she looked up at him and said, in the same quiet level tone, "The blue in the rider's coat." "The specific shade. That blue. Prussian blue. I wonder if you noticed it." "I am familiar with Prussian blue," said Lord Thornwick. "Then you know it wasn't synthesized until the early 1700s, said Miss Pruitt. "The painting is dated 1665, decades before the pigment existed." She paused. "It's a very good forgery, extremely good. The aging on the craquelure is genuinely impressive, and the provenance documents are the most convincing I've seen outside of Paris. But the painter made one error, and it's the kind of error that only someone who has spent considerable time with original Wouwermans in the Mauritius would catch, because you have to have seen enough of his actual blues to know that this one is chemically impossible." The gallery had gone quite still. Lord Thornwick had a face that was accustomed to revealing very little, and it revealed very little now. But the slight whitening around the jaw was a thing Nora noticed, because she noticed everything. Because noticing everything was how a woman in her position survived the rooms she was put into. "And that one," said Lord Frederick Derby, who was 74 years old and had spent 40 years as an attaché to various European courts, and who was leaning on a cane near the window with the expression of a man who has just been handed something unexpectedly delightful. He was nodding toward the smoky canvas on the stand. The woman at the window, the one no one had thought worth hanging. "Floris Van Dyck," said Nora Pruitt, "circa 1615. The handling of the light on the tablecloth is his. He did a thing with linen that nobody else did quite the same way. You can see it in the piece at the Rijksmuseum, though that one's larger. The woman's hands are wrong in the way his women's hands are always slightly wrong, which sounds like a flaw, but is actually how you know it's him. Forgers correct the flaws. They can't help it. They think they're improving the work." She closed her notebook. "That painting has been sitting against the wall because someone decided it was a copy. It isn't. I'd estimate it would bring considerably more at auction than the hunting scene did." She said all of this to Lord Derby, not to the Earl. She did not look at the Earl. "And I am going to stop us right there. Right there, in the long gallery at Wyndham Park, with Sir Alistair Wyndham standing very still, and his guests, wearing the expressions of people who have just seen something extraordinary, and are not quite sure of the etiquette for reacting to it. Right there, with Lord Frederick Derby's eyes absolutely sparkling behind his spectacles, and the Earl of Thornwick, the authority, the man who had authenticated the Mertons personally, standing in front of his error, and the woman who had quietly, methodically, without raising her voice, turned it over and shown him the underside of it. Right there, before I take you one single step forward, I need you to do something. Find the subscribe button for Moonlight at Marlowe. Press it. It costs you nothing, and it means the next story finds its way to you the moment I'm ready to tell it, which won't be long. Because there is always a next story, and I never run out of them, and they are always, every one of them, worth the having. And if you won't subscribe, then you owe me one. That is the arrangement I make with everyone who sits by this fire. I am extremely patient about collecting, and I do not forget. Now, come back to me, because I promised you the beginning, and the beginning is the only place where the whole thing makes sense. To understand Nora Pruitt, you need to understand what it meant to be raised by Geoffrey Pruitt, which was a thing that marked a person for life in ways that were equally gift and burden. He had been, I need you to feel the past tense there, because it is the hinge the whole story turns on, a scholar of painting. Not a curator, not a dealer, not a critic, a scholar, the kind who spends 18 months on a single attribution questions and considers that time well spent. The kind who wrote papers that 300 people read, and those 300 people were the only 300 people in the world who mattered to him. He had no money, which was the consistent theme of his life, and no permanent position, which was the consistent consequence of having no money. And he had travelled for most of Nora's childhood through the galleries and private collections of Europe, and the occasional sale of his expertise to a dealer who needed something authenticated, and was willing to pay for a man. Was never Nath who was never wrong. He had been to Florence and Amsterdam and Paris and Madrid. He had stood in front of more important paintings than most museum directors see in a career. And he had taken Nora with him, which was the eccentric decision that made her, because a mother who had died young had left Geoffrey Pruitt, unable to imagine leaving his daughter behind. She had grown up, therefore, in the back rooms of galleries and in the dusty storehouses of private collections, and in the long, quiet hours when her father stood in front of a painting and simply looked. He had taught her what to look for, the way pigment ages, the particular grammar of different national schools. How an Italian painter understood light differently than a Flemish one, and how a forger who learned painting in one tradition could never quite suppress its syntax when attempting another. The documentary evidence, the provenance chains, the estate inventories, the auction records stretching back centuries, the tiny structural signatures painters left without knowing, the habitual decisions of a trained hand that repeat across a body of work, the way handwriting repeats, the way you can recognize a person's voice across a room before you see their face. He taught her all of this not because he had a plan for what she would do with it, but because it was what he had to give, and because he believed, unfashionably and absolutely, that the quality of a person's education had nothing to do with whether that person happened to be a daughter. A painting doesn't care who's looking at it, he told her once, in front of a small Vermeer in a private collection in Delft, when she was 12 years old and had just correctly identified why a competing attribution was wrong. It gives up its secrets to whoever knows how to look. That's the only democracy there is in this business, Nora. Not who you are. What you see. She was 21 when he died. He died between one grant and the next, which was the kind of timing Geoffrey Pruitt could be counted on for. And Nora discovered in the weeks that followed exactly what the world was willing to pay a young woman in possession of an extraordinary eye and no other resources. The answer, was, not much. She could not take an academic position. She could not approach the major dealers as an equal. She had tried, and the conversations had been polite and fruitless, the kind where the other party has already decided not to hear you before you've finished your first sentence. She could not publish under her own name without the institutional affiliation that gave a woman's opinion the weight it would have had automatically in a man's. She had become a companion. It was the ceiling her world offered her, and she had learned, over 5 years of fetching raps and managing correspondence and sitting in chairs at gatherings she had not been invited to, that the correct thing to do with everything her father had given her was to keep it very, very quiet. The first collector's wife she had worked for had let her go for correcting an attribution at a dinner party. Not unkindly, only because a paid companion who knew more than the guests was an embarrassment rather than an asset. Lady Crane was the employer who had taken her on afterward, partly because Lady Crane herself was a genuine enthusiast who occasionally wanted an intelligent opinion, and partly because Lady Crane was good-natured enough not to feel threatened by intelligence in the people she employed. Nora had been with Lady Crane for 3 years, and she had learned, in those 3 years, to sit in chairs at the edges of rooms and keep her notebook and her conclusions to herself, because the world of collectors and dealers and experts was very small and very interconnected, and a woman in her position who made enemies of the wrong people would find herself without a position at all. She had made her peace with it. She had told herself she had made her peace with it. She had not. You cannot make peace with the silencing of the one thing you were made to do. You can only reach a kind of armed truce, and armed truces, in my experience, hold only until someone fires the first shot. Lord Thornwick had fired it in a pleasant, carrying voice, while looking at a painting she had correctly identified in under a minute. The afternoon after the gallery, he found her in the library. She had gone there because Lady Crane was resting, and the library at Wyndham Park was the one room the other guests consistently avoided. Books, in Sir Alister's circle, being the sort of thing one owned rather than read. And she had brought her notebook and 3 reference volumes she had found on the shelves, including an old catalogue of Flemish paintings that was out of date, but still useful, and she was cross-referencing the Van Dyck attribution against it when the door opened. She did not look up. She had learned not to react to the sound of doors in rooms where she was not expected to be, because looking up when someone entered was an invitation to be asked to leave. "The Van Dyck," said the Earl of Thornwick from the doorway. "You," said Rijksmuseum, catalogue number. She looked up then. He was standing in the door with the expression of a man who has spent the hours since the gallery, conducting the kind of internal reckoning he is accustomed to avoiding. It was not a comfortable expression. It sat on him the way a new coat sits on a man who is used to armor. "Secti A 4830, she said. "The still life with cheeses, though the composition is different from the Wyndham piece. The hand treatment is the link." He came into the room. He did not sit down. He stood in the way of men who are not accustomed to the suppliant position and are trying to manage a situation they have not been in before. "Where did you study?" "I didn't," she said. "I grew up in my father's wake. He was Geoffrey Pruitt." There was a pause. The Earl of Thornwick knew the name, she could see it. Anyone in that world knew the name. Geoffrey Pruitt's attribution work on the Hartley collection was still cited. His paper on workshop copies in the Venetian tradition was considered definitive. "Pruitt's daughter," said the Earl, and there was something in his voice she could not immediately identify, something that was not quite what she expected. "I read everything he published. I wrote to him once, when I was young and still building my own eye, about the Leavens attribution question." "He never responded." "He never responded to anyone," said Nora. "He considered correspondence a distraction from looking. I apologize on his behalf." Something shifted in the Earl's face. Not quite a smile. The preliminary motion that precedes a smile in a man who has disciplined himself against them. "How long were you abroad with him?" "Most of my childhood. Florence for 2 years, Amsterdam for 3, Paris twice, Madrid for a winter." She closed the catalogue. "He died in London. We'd come back because he had a commission, and then he didn't, and then he was gone. I don't recommend dying in London in November. It has no compensating qualities." The Earl came and sat down then across from her at the library table. Not too close. He had the instincts of a careful man. You correctly identified a Prussian blue anachronism in a painting I authenticated. Yes. I authenticated it 3 times. 2 other experts concurred. I know, I read the catalogue. And you saw it in how long? About 11 minutes, said Nora. The crackler took me a few extra minutes because it really is exceptional work. Whoever made it was talented enough to have done something genuinely worthwhile with that talent. That seems like a waste, but I suppose it always does. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable, which was surprising, because silences in rooms with Lord Thornwick were, by report, reliably uncomfortable. What else do you see, he said, in the collection? And Nora Pruitt made a decision that she would recognize, later, as the precise moment the truce broke. She could have deflected. She had years of practice at deflecting, at saying something modest and leaving rooms gracefully, at folding herself small. It was the safe thing. It was the thing 5 years of dependence had made automatic. But she was tired in the way you get tired when the thing you have spent your whole life learning to do goes unused for 5 years, and the Earl of Thornwick was looking at her with the particular, reluctant attention of a man who has been genuinely surprised and does not know what to do with that feeling. And so she opened the notebook. And she told him what she saw. She told him about the Rembrandt drawing that wasn't, and why. She told him about the 2 portraits in the dining room that were genuine and the one that wasn't, and how you could tell by the way the ears were rendered, because ear rendering was the thing studio assistants almost always got wrong. She told him about the small panel painting in Sir Alistair's study that nobody had thought much of, and that she was almost certain was Early Hull's. She talked for 20 minutes without stopping, which was 20 minutes more than she had talked about painting to anyone in 5 years. And the Earl of Thornwick listened, really listened, in the way of someone who follows a difficult argument without losing the thread, who catches references before you've finished making them. The Hals, he said when she finished. You said almost certain. The provenance is incomplete. I can't confirm the Amsterdam period without a chain of ownership before it entered the family. Almost certain is as far as I'll go without documentation. My father bought that panel at an estate sale, said the Earl, for a few shillings if the story's to be believed. It's been sitting in the back of a study at Thornwick House for 15 years. She stared at him. Do you have any documentation from the estate sale? I have no idea, I've never looked. My lord, said Nora Pruitt, with a patience she did not entirely feel, if that is a genuine Early Hals, you may have a small fortune sitting in someone's back study. I am aware of how Hal's prices have moved, he said, with a dryness that was clearly habitual but felt, in that moment like a different thing from his gallery dryness, less a weapon than a reflex. I will look for the documentation. I would like very much to see it if you find it. Yes, said the Earl, and he looked at her the way he had not looked at her in the gallery, directly and without performance. I imagine you would. It should have been that, and no more. It should have been a professional exchange between 2 people who happened to share an area of expertise, after which turned to their respective positions in Sir Alistair's autumn gathering. A lady's companion and an earl had no natural further occasion for conversation, and Nora knew it, and she knew that the sensible thing was to return to her notebook and her catalogue, and Lady Crane's shawl, and the careful silence she had built around herself. But the Earl came to the library again the following morning, and the morning after that, and those mornings became the 1 hour of the day that Nora Pruitt could speak, fully and without performance, about the thing she understood better than almost anyone in England. He was formidable. He had genuine knowledge that went deeper than she had expected, a visual memory that was close to extraordinary, and a habit of argument that pushed at the edges of her conclusions until they were better or broken. Talking with him was the hardest intellectual work she had done since her father died, and it was the most alive she had felt in 5 years. But out in company, in the drawing room, at dinner, in the gallery, where the guests gathered to admire what they couldn't quite see clearly. He was again and entirely the Earl of Thornwick, the public version. Cold and authoritative and precise, a man who had decided that certainty is the best protection against intimacy. She watched him do it. She watched him use his expertise the way she had seen him use it in the gallery, as a way of establishing distance rather than connection, as a wall rather than a window, and it bothered her more each day than it would have a week ago, because she knew now what was on the other side of the wall, and watching a man choose, over and over again, to lock himself behind it when he had the key in his own pocket, was the particular frustration of someone who recognizes the prison from the outside. It came to a head over the watercolors. Sir Alistair's niece, Miss Harriet Wyndham, golden-haired, 19, clearly produced for the purpose of catching the Earl's attention, which he endured with the weary tolerance of a man who has been the object of this particular exercise many times and has long since stopped being flattered by it, had been persuaded by her anxious uncle to show the assembled company her artwork. She was not without talent. The talent was modest and imperfectly trained, but it was genuine and it was hers, and Nora could see it in the way the girl handled the paper, the way she had instincts about value and tone that nobody had ever properly developed. The Earl looked at the watercolors for perhaps 8 seconds. Then he turned to the man beside him and made an observation about decorative arts and their relationship to serious study that was quiet and polished and devastating, delivered with the particular perfection of a man who can wound someone so elegantly that the wound takes a moment to feel. And Harriet Wyndham went from pink with hope to white with humiliation in the span of a single breath, and the guests who heard it did the thing that guests do, which is to pretend they hadn't. Nora put down her teacup. "The impasto in the third piece," she said into the drawing room, clearly enough to be heard by the people who had just heard the Earl. "The way you've built the texture in the tree line, where did you learn that?" She was speaking to Harriet, not to Lord Thornwick, not to anyone else, just to the girl. "That's not something you pick up from copying prints. That requires actual observation." Harriet looked at her with the startled expression of someone who has not expected to be addressed. My governess showed me some of it, and I practiced at the window in the mornings, looking at the garden." "At the actual garden," said Nora, not from memory. "Yes. Then you already understand the most important thing there is to understand about painting, and a great many people with more training than you don't." She turned to look at the watercolor again, not at the Earl. "If you want to develop it properly, there are 3 things. May I?" And she spent the next 10 minutes talking to Harriet Wyndham about her watercolors, and the whole drawing room listened, and what they heard was not a defense or a rebuke. It was simply a woman who knew what she was looking at, seeing it clearly and saying so, and it was the most natural thing in the world, and it made the Earl's assessment feel, by contrast, like exactly what it was. When she finished, Harriet Wyndham was looking at her with the confused, dawning gratitude of someone who expected to be ignored, and Lord Thornwick was looking at Nora with an expression she had not seen on him before. She had seen his cold face. She had seen his library face. She had not seen this one, which was something more uncomfortable than either. He found her in the gallery that evening, after dinner, when the other guests had gone to cards. She was standing in front of the Van Dyck, the real one, the woman at the window, which Sir Alistair had that afternoon ordered properly hung on the strength of Nora's assessment and Lord Derby's vigorous corroboration, in a better light than anything else in the room. "You did it deliberately," said the Earl. "The watercolors." "I said what I saw," said Nora. "You said it at the exact moment that was most useful for making a point to me." She turned to look at him. "Yes, I did. I'm not ashamed of it." He was quiet for a moment. The gallery at this hour was empty of other people, and the candles had been left burning, and the light was warmer than the grey November afternoon, and the woman in the Van Dyke looked out her painted window with the calm of someone who has arranged herself in exactly the right relation to the light and intends to stay there. "My father collected," said the Earl, and Nora heard in the shift of his voice that he was doing something he did not do easily. He was not kind about it. He had very decided opinions about what was worth keeping and what wasn't. He extended this to people. "I see," said Nora. "I inherited the collection, and apparently the methodology." He said this with a precision that was self-accusation rather than confession, the way a very honest man states a conclusion he finds unpleasant. "It's useful in auction rooms. Less so, I begin to think, in drawing rooms." "Considerably less so," said Nora. "You are not diplomatic," said the Earl. "I spent 5 years being diplomatic," she said. "I find it is a skill that improves with disuse." She looked at the Van Dyke. "The woman in this painting. Van Dyke painted her 6 times by some estimates, always at a window, always that same quality of stillness. Art historians argue about who she was. My father thought the question didn't matter. What mattered, he said, was that she existed long enough to keep sitting still in good light while a great painter looked at her carefully, and that because of that, she has been looked at carefully for 400 years. He thought there was something to be said for being the person who holds still in good light." She paused. "I've been still in bad light for 5 years. I'm not certain I recommend it." The Earl of Thornwick looked at the painting for a long moment. Then he said, "I have a small fortune's worth of howls in a back study in Shropshire, because no one ever looked at it carefully enough to see what it was." "Yes," said Nora, "that is exactly the situation." Another silence. Then, carefully, with the precision of a man who chooses each word the way he would choose a brushstroke, "Miss Pruitt, I should like very much to be the person who looks carefully enough." She looked at him. He was not talking about the howls. "That depends," said Nora, "on whether you're willing to be wrong sometimes. Because I have watched you for a week, and you are remarkable, and you are wrong about approximately 1 thing 10, which is a better average than most, but you treat being wrong as a catastrophe rather than a correction, and a man who cannot be corrected cannot be taught, and my cannot be taught cannot keep looking. My father was wrong constantly. He celebrated it. He said the only paintings he learned from were the ones that made him doubt his first impression." Lord Thornwick looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I have authenticated a painting with an impossible pigment." He said it the way you put something down that you've been holding too long. "I think I have satisfied the minimum requirement for being wrong." "You've satisfied the minimum," said Nora. "The question is whether it continues." And she looked at him steadily, and he looked at her steadily, and in the quiet of the gallery, the Van Dyke woman looked out her window at whatever light was outside it, calm and held and permanent. I will not pretend to you that the rest was simple. I have told too many stories to pretend that the moment of understanding is the same as the moment of change, because it never is. He came to the library every morning. He argued with her, properly argued, the kind of argument where you are both trying to reach the truth rather than to win, and it was the best argument Nora had had since her father died, which is to say it was the best thing in her life. And in the evenings in company he was better. Not cured, not transformed, but better. The way a man is better, when he has been shown something clearly and has chosen to look at it rather than away from it. There was an evening near the end of the fortnight when Sir Alister's dealer came up from London with 3 paintings for consideration, and the dealer made a point, quietly and as if by accident, of addressing every observation to the Earl and none to Nora, and the Earl, after the second time, said simply, "Miss Pruitt's opinion on the provenance chain, if you would." Her familiarity with the Amsterdam market in this period exceeds mine. The dealer looked as if he had been handed a glass of water that turned out to be something else entirely. He addressed Nora. Nora gave her opinion. The Earl corroborated it in 3 sentences, and nobody said anything about it afterward, but Lord Derby from his chair by the window, looked at the two of them with that same expression of unguarded joy that he had first produced at the mention of Prussian blue. They were married in March, which gave the winter to talk and the spring to begin. It was not a fashionable match. A Pruitt was nobody in the world, the Earl's world ran on, and 5 years as a companion was not a recommendation, and the world said so at length and with the cheerful persistence it brings to disapproval. But the world, as usual, was measuring the wrong things. It saw a great man making an eccentric choice. It did not see what had actually of a woman. It did not see what had actually happened, which was two people built a very careful wall around the thing they most feared losing, and who had found in each other the one person capable of seeing through the wall to what was behind it, and who had done the braver thing, which is not building the wall higher, but setting down the bricks. Harriet Wyndham, I am glad to tell you, found her way to a proper teacher the following year, a woman in Bath who had studied in Paris, and who recognized in Harriet exactly the impasto instinct that Nora had seen that afternoon in the drawing-room. She showed work in a London exhibition 3 years later, under her own name, and it was reviewed favorably by 2 critics and unfavorably 1, which is the correct ratio for work that is genuinely doing something. She and the new Countess of Thornwick corresponded for years afterward. The bond between 2 women who have each been seen clearly to look is a particular one, and it doesn't dissolve easily, and doesn't dissolve easily. And the Earl and his Countess. They catalogued the collection at Thornwick House together, which took 14 months, and which the Earl later described as the best 14 months of his life, though he said it in the understatement of a man who has been trained to say things quietly. The howls turned out to be genuine, and the documentation was in a letter in the estate records that no one had thought to read. They found 3 other attributions that needed revision. They found 2 that needed upgrading. They found in a crate in the cellar with some broken furniture a small panel painting that Nora recognized in the beam of a lamp late one February night. And she made a sound she had not made since her father was alive, and the Earl heard it and came to look and was quiet for a very long time. He never used his expertise as a wall again. I will not tell you, he softened, a mind that precise does not go soft, and she would not have wanted it to. But he turned it, all of it, away from the project of being untouchable, and toward the project of seeing clearly, which is what it had always been best at, and what it had been prevented from being by the fear of being wrong. And she, for the first time in 5 years, opened the notebook she had kept half-filled, and finished it, and started another, and put her name on things, and was wrong sometimes, and corrected herself, and was right most of the time, and was known for it. He had called her the household staff in a carrying voice in a gallery, certain she had no answer. She had answered in the language of Prussian blue and impasto and provenance chains, and the specific grammar of a Flemish hand, and he had spent the rest of his life grateful she had, and they read the old catalogues together in the mornings in the library at Thornwick House, in good light from the east windows, with the small Van Dyck woman's hung above the pole-piece, looking out at Fad, at whatever light was outside her frame, permanent and careful and fully seen at last. You have been patient with me through a long November at Wyndham Park, and through the slow thaw of a very defended man, and I would not have told it without you at the other end of the fire. If it has left you with something, a warmth, a quiet resolution to stop keeping your best self in a back room and waiting for a world that deserves it, then come back to Moonlight at Marlowe, because there are many more of these, and every one of them has a center that holds. Subscribe, and the next story finds you the moment I'm ready to tell it. And if you won't, well, you know what you owe me. I keep a long and patient record, and I am always here, and the fire doesn't go out.